Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cheryl Shindrak, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Canada-Ireland Foundation and Chair of the Arts and Culture Programming Committee. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to our ongoing Canada-Ireland Talks series. This month, we are honoring Imbolc, the Celtic celebration of women. While an ancient tradition, Imbolc remains as important today as it was in pre-Christian times to honor women and their role in society. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Siofra O'Leary, Vice President of the European Court of Human Rights, joining us all the way from Luxembourg, and Dr. Susan Storey, Vice Chair of the Toronto chapter of the International Women's Forum. Before I call on our chair and founder, Robert Cairns, to introduce our speakers, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that our organization operates on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. The Greater Toronto region is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also want to acknowledge that the City of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. We know that you are joining us this evening from many locations, and so we invite you to reflect upon the territory that you reside in and think about how you derive a living from it. We also acknowledge you to, we also ask you to acknowledge the longtime Indigenous proprietors, stewards, treaty holders, as well as the birds, the fish, the animals, and the spirits therein. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping matters. We will be recording this evening's session so that we may put it on YouTube for future viewing. And you will notice that your audio and video is not active. This is so that we can all focus on our two speakers this evening. We do, however, encourage you to engage via the Q&A function on your screens, which I will be monitoring throughout the evening. And at the end of the conversation, time permitting, we hope to be able to share your questions and comments with our guest speaker this evening. We hope you enjoy an evening of great, stimulating conversation from these two remarkable women. And so now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to invite our chair and founder of the Canada-Ireland Foundation, Robert Cairns, to come give greetings and introduce tonight's speakers. Robert.
Cheryl, thank you very much for that lovely welcome and introduction. And what a great pleasure it is to welcome Judge Siofra O'Leary in Luxembourg and Dr. Susan Storey here in Toronto. The Canada-Ireland Foundation celebrates the story of the Irish contribution to Canada and also Canada's great and long-standing friendship for Ireland. We're a diaspora organization that takes great pride in the success of men and women from the island of Ireland, wherever we see or find them, particularly in Canada, but also elsewhere, obviously, those who go back to Ireland or who are in other parts of Europe or indeed anywhere in the world. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Dr. O'Leary, and we follow your progress with pride and excitement. You have a very challenging position, and we thank you for taking the time after a long day to stay up as late as this, talking to our audience here and around the world. So thank you so much for doing that. You and I and Dr. Storey, we all share in common the fact that we're UCD graduates. And of course, as Cheryl has already pointed out, you got your basic degree in law from University College Dublin and your PhD from the University Institute in Florence, one of the most fantastic cities in the world. So that is wonderful. I had the great pleasure of visiting Florence at a few occasions, and so many things were invented in Florence, particularly the salvation of many law tracts that were the work of a small number of people who saved those manuscripts and converted them into typed form and saved them from obliteration. So your experience and extensive knowledge of the legal dynamic in Europe is without exception. And we congratulate you on your new appointment as vice chair of the European Court of Human Rights. So congratulations on that. We're looking forward to your comments this evening. Dr. Susan Storey, my dear friend, whom I had the great pleasure of meeting many years ago in Toronto. And again, I happened to see her face gazing out at me from the Globe and Mail newspaper as one of Canada's top 40 under 40. And I thought, well, there's someone we need to speak with. And Sue Storey has been a fantastically successful leader in business in Canada. She's a phenomenal volunteer for all sorts of activities involving both women's issues as the vice chair of finance for the Women's Institute in the Toronto chapter. And I know over the years has done great work for children at risk, street kids, human trafficking. And so, you know, you've taken your career, your business success and given back extensively. And then, of course, having finished your career at CIBC, you decided to go back to your university and take your PhD in architectural history. So Sue, hats off to you. And I couldn't think of anyone better equipped, better suited to have this conversation with Dr. O'Leary. And on behalf of Canada Ireland Foundation and all of our viewers here this evening, thank you. And thank you to you both. So we look forward to your conversation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Robert. Such a nice introduction. And it's so nice to be with all of you, hopefully from all over the world. I want to welcome Judge O'Leary, and we're going to call each other by our first name. So I'm Susan and she's Siofra. And I want to welcome her to this stage, this great stage for her to discuss her work. And we're going to start at the beginning if we can, because you say in many cases around when I've heard you talk that you're a proud member of the Irish diaspora. So tell us about yourself.
Thank you very much, Sue, and good evening to everyone in Canada, in Ireland, and anywhere else you're listening in from. It's a real pleasure and also an honour to be asked by the Canada Ireland Foundation to talk with you this evening. My first reaction when I was asked to speak to you all was, are you sure they really would be interested in an Irish European Court judge? But I'll do my best to justify you giving up an hour of your time. My story is very much like the story of other members of the Irish diaspora in Europe, and I'm sure in Canada. I grew up in South Dublin. I'm the fifth of 6 children, born to an Irish Army officer who later worked for many years in the Irish Parliament, and to an incredibly modest and highly intelligent Irish mother who, like many women of her generation, had worked in the public sector, and when she got married was required to give up her job. And we were, in a sense, her job. All 6 of us, we learned to read before we went to school. We were kept busy by our mother at home, and ours was a comfortable but not a well-off family. We were well off in one sense, and that was they put all of their efforts into our education. And I think I speak for all my siblings with whom I spoke to before we talked this evening, to say that we're very proud of being a family like that. 4 of us live abroad, 3 in the United Kingdom, and myself in Luxembourg and Strasbourg. I can explain to the audience a little bit later the relevance of those 2 cities to my professional and my personal life. So I started off in South Dublin, went to an Irish national school, and then on to school in Muckross Park College, which some of your listeners might know, in Donnybrook, and then went on to UCD.
So when I was looking at your background and the path you took, I wanted to ask you where this lifelong dedication to human rights for a girl from the south side of Dublin, where did that come from? Who did you model yourself on?
It's a good question, and I wonder, do I have the full answer? I look back into the family history, and I think there were many role models. My maternal grandmother and grandfather were headmaster and headmistress in a small school in the Glens of Antrim. My paternal grandmother learned French and worked in London just after the First World War, and then came back to Ireland. My mother, as I said, didn't go to university, but she was incredibly erudite. One of the things we always remember her saying was, if we ask questions about words, because she was a wordsmith, if you didn't know the word, there's a dictionary in the house, go and look it up. For many, many years, I was convinced I would be a nurse, like 4 of my aunts on both my mother and my father's side. But then I had a fairly good sense of myself and my own character, even when I was a young woman. And I realized the hierarchy of hospitals was probably not something I was going to fit in with quite well. I didn't want to become a doctor. I did want to be in a caring profession. I was very good at English. I loved history. I loved politics and debating. And when those are the things that you love at school, you start heading in a particular direction. And that direction was the law. And something I picked up on the interview you had last year with Mary McAleese, the former president, was that she came upon the idea of studying law, and she was told, well, you can't do that. You are a woman, first of all, and second of all, your family's not in the law. By the 1980s, when I came up with this idea, the idea of not studying law because you're a woman was no longer relevant. But not being from a legal family was still relevant. And one of only 2, I think, real discussions I had with my mother was whether I really should study law. And I said, Mum, let me try it. I'll find my way. And indeed, I think I found my way. So it was an interest in people, in society, in caring, but also a love for politics in the very broad sense. And that led me into the law, and I took to it like a duck to water. I absolutely loved it. I never looked back on studying physics, chemistry, and honors mathematics. I absolutely loved the law, and very quickly could see that what I loved about the law was that it dealt with people. I loved constitutional law. I loved the human rights chapters. I loved family law, employment law, criminal law. What I wasn't as interested in was in the commercial side of the law. It's more lucrative, but it wasn't for me. And so I think my connection with, if you like, rights issues started at home, where we were always debating around the family table. We were very well informed. We were quite politically engaged. Politically, as in we were interested in the world in Ireland and around us. And then the subject just suited me down to the ground, and I never looked back.
Well, it's when I look at around the world at women in powerful positions, many of them start off, and men too, many of them start off in the law. But you started off at my university, University College Dublin, our university, and many of the people on this call are also alumni of that university. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to reflect a little bit on those years, as the best years of my life at UCD. So I hope you had the same experience. Tell us a little bit about that.
For a South Dublin girl going to UCD, I suppose you could say it's quite a natural thing to do. My family was very much a UCD family. That often is the case. I have one uncle who studied in Trinity, but the rest of us are all UCD heads, as we would say. It was an easy cycle or bus ride up the road. Remember at that time as well, I studied in the 1980s. My parents were putting 6 kids through college, and we were working summer jobs to also finance ourselves. We couldn't live away from home. We lived at home. That's, I think, the story for most Dublin kids at the time, and even perhaps still. It was a fabulous university. It was open, changing, dynamic. I liked the open campus. I liked the ethos. Studying law in those years was very interesting. The fact that you were going to interview me, of course, threw me back into that time. We were reading judgments written by Irish judges, I have to say, all male at the time. I think the first woman was perhaps just appointed to the High Court at the time. Her name was Mella Carroll. And the judgments of these extremely intelligent and highly esteemed judges were very, very interesting. But our young minds were beginning to question some of the values that we saw being handed down by the Supreme Court at the time. we didn't have enough intellectual knowledge or confidence to be able to pinpoint what was it we were disagreeing with. But our clever young UCD law professors were helping us to open windows on ideas and critical thinking that we, and I think Ireland, very much needed at the time. And also contemporaneously, relatively young lawyers like Mary Robinson, our first Irish female president, were bringing cases to the two European courts seeking equality for women, but also for minorities, homosexual men at the time, a very famous case called Norris against Ireland, which was brought to the Strasbourg court. So it was a very interesting time. Ireland was still a very Catholic conservative country at the time, but fresh winds were beginning to blow. And we were a generation which were before the boom, well before the Celtic Tiger hit. We were all comfortable, but none of us were well off. But we were so interested in discovering the world and each other, because remember, I'm sure many of your listeners will remember, at that time, most of us went to all girls or all boys schools. So going to UCD was also our first chance to meet, debate, and discover the other gender. We, of course, had our brothers at home, but it wasn't quite the same thing.
I do remember, because I was in UCD in 1981, and my student number starts with 81. So that's kind of funny, which I still have the same number today. But you have a family now, and you were recounting to me the story about your son is at UCD. Tell us about that.
That's right. So, well, I have one child who's 2 years off her Leaving Cert or her European Baccalaureate, but my son is in UCD studying, and I had this wonderful experience of going back to my 30th BCL reunion and being on the campus celebrating this event, knowing that he was a few hundred meters down the campus in his student accommodation. He was in first year at the time. And for someone who is a member of the Irish diaspora and who went abroad by choice, chance, circumstance, we'll come back to that in a few minutes, I'm sure, to have your children go back to your own country and study there is a wonderful way of rediscovering UCD, of seeing how much it's changed, but also of seeing how much many things remain the same. Of course, they unfortunately are the COVID university generation of students. And I think a big shout out for them, because in my experience, they've been incredibly patient, tolerant, protective of their elders, and it hasn't been easy for them. So they haven't had the same experience we had, but they're managing very well.
Indeed, and let's hope that they get back into on campus as soon as possible. Now, I want to move over to your professional life and talk a little bit about that. You've lived, I think you said 30 years or 32 years outside of Ireland. And I wanted to ask you why Europe was your career path, and why you chose Europe and not Ireland. We could start there.
Yeah, I think this is where the choice, chance, and circumstance mix comes in. As I said, I loved studying law, and I loved studying European law. At that time, it would have been called European Economic Communities Law, because we were in the EEC at the time. And I found this whole new interesting system of law, which I could go and study elsewhere for a year and do a master's. Because I didn't come from a legal family, I wasn't entirely convinced that I had either the confidence or the economic backing to go and risk it at the bar, which was difficult at the time. And I wasn't particularly interested in becoming a solicitor. That I was quite clear on quite early. So I decided I would try and study abroad for a year. And I started applying for scholarships in what's called the College of Europe in Bruges, which is specialized in European law, but also the European University Institute in Florence, also specializing in European law. And I left Ireland in 1989 thinking I was going for a year, and the rest is history. I stayed on in Florence because I realized I'm actually very young relative to all my German and Dutch contemporaries. They were several years older. I mean, 5, 6, 8 years older than me, and I had just left university in Dublin. So I stayed on to do a PhD. But then I met my future husband, who was also studying for his PhD and who happened to come from Spain. Now, in 1989, there was no such thing as Ryanair and low-cost flights around Europe. So our dilemma, our challenge when we finished our PhDs in Florence was to try and find a place where we could both work, or where we could work relatively close to each other. I should digress, going back to Robert Kern's introduction and his reference to Florence. It is one of the most magnificent cities in Europe. And I think we had the luck of living in it before low-cost travel meant that it was an all year round tourist destination. We had Florence to ourselves in the winter months. And the Institute is based in these beautiful buildings on the hills above Florence in a place called Fiesole. So where I studied in the evening was in a cloister where the Medicis used to live. And meanwhile, my contemporaries were training to be solicitors and barristers in Dublin. Some of them had much more money than I did, but I did feel very blessed to be able to stop and specialize in something and be funded with a scholarship to do so, which was really quite unusual at the time. The choice was to study abroad. The chance was to meet my husband. And then the circumstance was that we had to find a path where we could both try and live together or work relatively close together. And that's a path which led us, me to Brussels just after Florence, him to the UK where he lectured in Leicester. Then we went to Seville, London, Luxembourg, Frankfurt, back to Luxembourg and Strasbourg. And in the meantime, I taught for many years in the College of Europe in Bruges. So I was always very interested in European law, but then actually European law and Europe became an integral part of my life. I'm now the mom of two Spanish-Irish children. In my house, we speak Spanish and English. To us, it's perfectly natural. We live in cities where people speak multiple languages. And it just is, that's our life story. It's very strange or unusual for other people. It's so entirely natural to us.
Indeed, I think for many of the people listening tonight, the immigrant part of the Irish diaspora, they're used to moving, they're used to spending a few years here and there, and they're used to speaking different languages, and that is very unusual for people who've been brought up in the same place. So what a fascinating, and living in Florence, I envy you that. Now I want to talk a little bit about your work and ask a couple of questions. You've obviously very accomplished on the academic side, but you also have published 2 books, and I think it's worth mentioning them. The Evolving Concept of Community is your first book, and Employment Law at the European Court of Justice. But you've also published extensively in academic journals, in EU law monographs, and most of your work, or the work that you're doing, was on the protection of fundamental rights in the EU, employment law, free movement of persons and services, EU citizenship. And before we get into the dynamics of that and the work that you're doing now, I wanted to share with us, how did you navigate your way through the career and the choices that you made and the barriers that you faced? Like on a personal level, how did you manage this very peripatetic career all over the place and still manage to write books, have children, and end up in the you did?
Where do I start? I think the first thing is I sort of fell into academia, again, by chance and necessity. I was all set up to train as a solicitor in London after Florence, but we were going to have to try and commute between London and Seville, which at the time was impossible. So I realized academia in European law was portable. I could do it wherever I was based. We didn't have all the technology we have at our disposal now, but with a good library and photocopies, you can get by, you can do a lot. So that's what I did. And I actually taught English 1 year in Seville because I couldn't find a job in academia when we first arrived there. But I was teaching English in the morning in a business school, and then the next day I'd fly to Finland and I would be presenting my academic work at a conference. It was an odd life, but it was a way of keeping up my own professional career as I tried to crack a little entry into academic life in my husband's country. Ultimately, we found Spain academia at the time very inaccessible, so we moved to London. And from there, I got a call from a judge at the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg who said, please, will you come and join my cabinet? Now, the work I did would be probably what you would call a law clerk in Canada. So you have these, I imagine, in your Supreme Court, in the US Supreme Court as well. So you usually have 1, 2, 3 law clerks working with a particular judge or justice. So that's what I ended up doing in Luxembourg. And what did I discover? I discovered that I absolutely adored judicial work. It gave you the practical side of the law, but yet it gave you also the space, the intellectual space that you have in academia, because the 2 European courts, and I'll explain the 2 European courts in a few moments, are basically courts which set down legal standards for the relevant states of the European Union or of the Council of Europe. So I started working with the Italian judge in Luxembourg, and I have moved a lot, but it was also actually from the base in Luxembourg. Once the children arrived, we tried to stay as stable as possible. I taught for 11+ years in the College of Europe in Bruges. I have taken multiple trains in my life. I can work anywhere, subject to any noise. And when the kids went to bed, then I'd finish off the articles. And now as an older professional, I look back like many women and men do, and I go, how did I do it? Where did I get the energy? But you do have the energy, and you do have a certain, a grit, I suppose, a determination. Maybe that comes from our Irish roots. And I loved the combination of the judicial work and the teaching, because I felt that the judicial work made me a better teacher. The teaching work made me better in court. And I find that even to this day, the years I did of teaching are a way of explaining very complex things to people. And you learn the art of communication. And I think they were both very complementary. I was very lucky. I had some wonderful judicial and professional role models. The Italian judge I mentioned, and also an Irish female judge who was the first female judge appointed to the European Court of Justice, Fidelma Mackin. And I was very lucky in my bosses. They chose me, and I suppose at a certain stage in your professional life, you also begin to choose them. You realize people who you won't work well with. I always wanted to be a good mom and be home. So if you're good enough at your job, you did sometimes have to say those cheeky things, which was, sorry, I have to leave now to collect the children. I can continue on this later on in the evening. But my good bosses let me do that, and I produced the work. And I think that's what you have to do.
Just a question that comes to mind, and I am a mother also, so experienced some of that, is that the barriers that we face as women, and motherhood takes up, our heart and our mind as much as our careers do or more. But did you find the path a little bit easier in Europe? You didn't work in Ireland, so you can't give an opinion on that. But do you think that the path was easier as a woman within the judicial system, or was it the judicial system that allowed you as a woman to advance? How would you see those issues?
I don't think the path was easier. And I'll explain why. In the place I was working, so this is an EU institution, the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, I was lucky enough to have a job when my children were small, which required an immense amount of work, but which I was also able to do in some ways around the children. So I was able to work when they went to bed, etc. Like many women of my generation, I encountered the same obstacles. I was brought up by egalitarians, male and female. So I actually believed until quite late in my 20s, early 30s, that we were all equal and people saw us that way. Very naive of me. Then you begin to have children, then you begin to try and rise up the ranks. And I think then you realize, oh, actually, some people view me a little bit differently. The reason why I think it wasn't easier in Europe was quite simply because the European Union is made up of now 27, previously 28 nationalities. So whereas gender may be a big issue in some workplaces, in that type of organization, nationality is also an issue. And if you come from a small country, if you like, the political weight of your nationality will be considerably lesser than, say, if you're going for a promotion running against German, French, Italian, Spanish, or other perhaps larger nationalities. It's not that there are quotas, but your nationality carries less weight. And so you have to carry the extra weight that perhaps others might consider that you're lacking.
Well, that's very interesting. And so what advice would you give to a young woman today who aspires to a career in the legal system in Europe, and particularly who's interested in human rights? What path would be some way that they could break into that?
First of all, follow a good legal training, whether it's nationally or at European level. Make sure that your legal training is excellent. Then get really good experience, either in practice or in academia. The best advice I would give, it wouldn't be limited to women. It's the advice I'd give any younger professional, is don't keep looking at the destination where you want to end up. Actually concentrate on the work you have in hand. Become very, very good at what you're doing now, and the destination will come naturally. Of course, you will encounter some obstacles, but concentrate on learning from the job in hand rather than looking 10 to 15 to 20 years down the road and saying, I want to be where you are now. Do the work at the coalface. I think that's the advice I would give. The one thing I've seen change as well, I hope that younger women will say this, is that the workplace has become, I think, a somewhat easier place for young professional women because they do have many more role models than we had. And because perhaps there is a degree of better sharing of household and childcare responsibilities between husbands and wives nowadays. They can't afford to be anything else except a team. And their bosses must have changed expectations as well. Certainly that's what I tried to practice when I was myself running a team. I had young fathers on the team as well as young mothers. They had to get home to collect their children too. And it's a change in the mentality of their managers and their superiors that brings about change, not just the change in the young professionals themselves.
I agree that there is change happening. It's always too slow for those of us who fight the cause every day. Thanks for that. I want to move on a little bit and ask you to explain something kind of crucial. You talked about the two court systems, and obviously your time at the Court of Justice of the European Union was critical in your journey to the judgeship at the European Courts of Human Rights and now being Vice President. Can you explain to us how those court systems actually work and how they refer to each other and refer to the European Union?
I can indeed, and I hope that the references to the Strasbourg and the Luxembourg courts thus far hasn't been too confusing for some of your listeners. To the Irish members of the audience, they will be more familiar with the European Union, which started off as the European Economic Communities. It was an economic integration program, which has now become an economic and political union. So the European Union has many European institutions, the European Commission, the European Parliament, or the European Council. And the judicial branch of that is based in Luxembourg, the European Court of Justice. When I started, there were 15 member states of the European Union in 1996. There are now, of course, 27, sadly, no longer 28 since Brexit. So the Court of Justice in Luxembourg is the judicial branch of the European Union. And they get cases from individuals from member states, but also primarily from national courts, asking them to give them guidance, interpretative guidance on European Union legislation. I won't go into the technicalities because it's too late in the evening in Luxembourg to explain the differences between the different types of EU legislation. The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg is actually born of a different body entirely, although it has links, of course, with the European Union. And that's the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is an organization which grew up out of course, the ashes and tragedy of the Second World War. And the idea was to create an organization which would fight to secure human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. in these countries, which have had, of course, been decimated after the atrocities and destruction of the Second World War. And the European Court of Human Rights was established in 1959 as, if you like, the judicial branch of the Council of Europe. In those early years, and Ireland was a member from the very beginning, there were a small number of member states, all of course from Western Europe, because the Iron Curtain had fallen through the middle of what is geographically Europe. And the court in the early years had very few cases. Between 1959 and 76, it had 18 cases. If you fast forward nowadays, following the fall of the Berlin Wall, there are 47 Council of Europe member states, ranging from Iceland out there beyond Ireland in the northwest, all the way down to Azerbaijan, Armenia, Ukraine, Russia, the Baltic states. And the members of the European Union, the member states, have to be members of the Council of Europe, and they have to be subject to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights is essentially a regional human rights court, and the convention is a regional human rights convention which derived from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted towards the end of the 1940s. So that's the difference between the two European courts. They belong to two different organizations. They do, I suppose you could say, they talk to each other. Some similar issues come before both courts, particularly now that the European Union it's got a much wider competence than it did in the past. It deals now with things like the European arrest warrant or asylum and immigration questions. These are issues which the European Union previously didn't touch on at all. The European Court of Human Rights has a much, much broader scope. The issues that it deals with range from the right to life in Article 2 to the right to marry or freedom of association, freedom of expression, the right to privacy. So one is a specialized human rights court. The other has a broader competence in terms of EU law.
Thank you. I had to say, I did not understand the difference myself until I started researching you, but of course it makes sense. So thank you for that explanation. I want to move on a little bit to issues that you deal with that transcend national borders. And last year when we had President McAleese, the former president of Ireland, talking with us, she said something that really resonated with all of us, that she said that our shared humanity can be our light, and we must insist we take care of human rights. That is the future. And she also said we must call out the isms, the sexism, the sectarianism, the racism, the homophobia. Before we move on to the very nature of the cases you deal with, can you comment on how you reconcile your legal obligations with the terrible injustices you witness every day?
When I was first appointed to the court, this was 2015, and I was appointed in July, and over the summer I was preparing some of the big cases that were coming up. We sit as single judges in a committee of 3 in a chamber of 7, and in what we call grand chamber cases. That's when we sit as 17 judges. These are the most serious cases. And I happen to have been drawn by lots in several cases. And one of them involved a child born of a surrogacy arrangement in Russia, a commercial surrogacy arrangement. And the case had been brought to us by the child's parents because the Italian authorities had, after a few months, intervened and removed the child from the family. And the case will never leave me because it was one of the first. And the childcare cases are a very good example of very, very difficult cases. And they're difficult at national level. They're also very difficult for an international court. We're not hearing the witnesses. We're not directly dealing with the evidence gathered by the national authorities. Our role is different, which is to intervene and check whether the national courts and the national authorities have done their job. And preparing that case over the summer, I realized that what I was facing into was 9 years in which I would have to perform what I think I would call a job which is equivalent to being a legal surgeon. You have to be intensely aware of the fact that you're dealing with human rights and human lives. But you also have to remain entirely professional and not dispassionate. There always has to be a connection between heart and head. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing my job properly. But I'm not there to impose my view. I'm not there to get emotional. I'm there to do a judicial job and to bring to the case the fairest possible balance and perspective that I can possibly bring. So you have to be very humanly engaged and you have to be very professional. Some cases never leave you. Another case, I remember I had been working all day on a case of a young Ukrainian who was in detention. He was never actually tried because he died before his trial came up. The conditions of detention in the prison, the brutality, the number of illnesses that he was suffering from while in detention. He died prematurely. And my own children were coming in from school to a warm house that evening. And I closed the file and I said, well, that's one I will never forget. Those cases don't leave you. But there are so many cases. We have 70,000 pending cases. And some are absolutely brutal. So there's a degree of the heart and head must work together, but the heart can never overtake the head in these cases.
Well, I know that you cover a wide and varied nature in your cases, and many of them have universal themes. I wanted you to address the advances in the rights of women and children and explain to us this parity of esteem that I have read about and many of us know nothing about. So maybe you could explain that to us and perhaps push it forward a little bit into these pandemic times or coming out of these pandemic times and the leadership needed on some of these issues. I know that's 3 questions I've asked you, which I promised myself I wouldn't do, but like just women's rights, women and children, the pandemic and how it affects it, and explain the parity of esteem.
I'll try my best because it is a very wide-ranging question. One of the things you see very quickly when you work in the Strasbourg court, in the European Court of Human Rights, is that you can sort of hold up a picture of the type of cases that each state has, and you get a fairly good x-ray of the state of health of society or legal issues in that particular state. Some countries have particular problems. Ireland, for some period of time, our problem was excessive length of legal proceedings. But one issue, domestic and gender-based violence, is an issue which you see cropping up across the board. North, south, east, west, you have issues of this nature. And I think in relation to these cases, you have to distinguish between protecting the individuals concerned from abuse and measures which actually seek to achieve equality. Now, on the abuse side, we unfortunately have a very high number of cases relating to, as I said, domestic violence, gender-based violence, discrimination against women, human trafficking, which is, I know, an area in which you've worked in a lot. And to give you an idea of the type of cases, I thought of 2 from 2021. We gave one judgment, Tunikova against Russia. The nature of the facts in this case, and also the instructions that the court gave, because we can sometimes give this to a respondent state, the defendant state is called the respondent state, were such that the New York Times picked up on this case. There were 4 applicants and all of them were subject to recurrent and escalating physical and psychological violence. One of the applicants had her hands chopped off with an axe. And in this case, the court found multiple violations of the convention, but also a failure on the part of the Russian authorities to acknowledge the seriousness and extent of the domestic violence problem. And in cases like this, what we see is that there is a failure to protect women from acts of domestic violence, a failure when complaints are lodged to carry out an effective investigation, and then a failure to actually provide training to the relevant officials, including judges, to treat gender-based violence. And that brings me to the second case, a case from Italy, JL against Italy. Now, the background to this case was an alleged gang rape by 7 men of the applicant. And of course, in any case like this, a criminal court is faced by 2 irreconcilable versions of the facts, and they have to balance the integrity and dignity of the accuser with the defense rights of the accused, who of course have to be presumed innocent. And in this case, the problem wasn't with the investigation or indeed with the trial court. The problem the court identified was actually in the judgments of the Court of Appeal, because of course they had to assess the credibility of the accuser, the alleged victim, but the language used by the court referred to her family situation, her sexual orientation, the nature of her clothing, her artistic and cultural activities, and what they were described as her non-linear life. So when the court found a violation of her right to privacy under Article 8, what it did was point out that it's essential in order to combat domestic and gender-based violence for the response of the authorities not to repeat sexist and stereotyped language or approach victims in a way which downplays the problem of gender-based violence in society. They're just two examples in 2021. Unfortunately, I could give you multiple others. But what the convention requires, essentially states to do, is to protect, prosecute, and prevent these things. And I know in the human trafficking field, those three issues are essentially at the core. But that's the abuse side of the picture. The equality side of the picture, of course, is somewhat different, and there's still a lot of work to be done. In our case law, you'll find a lot of cases involving questions relating to pension rights, social security rights, privacy rights, of course, in the past as well, reproductive rights. And there is, as I said, a lot of work to do. And in Europe, at least, a lot of work has been done on that front also in the Luxembourg court, the European Union court, where a lot of employment-related cases go. The point being that the stronger women's economic position is in society, the less likely they are to become, if you like, silent victims of certain types of abuse. And of course, I don't at all want to generalize.
Yes, and such has been the case for many years. Economic security is one of the leading ways for women to be able to move forward. Now we're running close to our Q&A, and I have tons of things here I wanted to ask you, but I'm going to ask you one last thing and then put it out to the chat lines. Is there a role for the Irish diaspora in advancing human rights, and where would you see that role?
I think that you had flagged this question for me, and I've been thinking about it long and hard. If we look back to our roots in Ireland, most of us come from very modest backgrounds. As I said, my grandparents were headmaster and mistress in a school in Antrim. My mother couldn't go to university. I was first generation university goer in my family with my siblings. But we're not far away from small holdings all around Ireland. My roots extend from Cork, Kerry to Roscommon and Antrim, and then to Dublin. And we've left our island, and we know many, many family relations who've gone abroad. We have been the outsiders. And I think in our societies, we should not forget what it means to be the outsider, to look different, to speak differently, to dress differently. I'm so often in situations where I am an outsider, but I manage that perfectly because I'm trained to do that now. And of course, I'm economically more comfortable now than my forebearers would have been when they left for the United States. But if I look around Europe and I'm looking at major referenda which took place in different countries, in the United Kingdom, also in other countries, I won't trespass into politics. It often strikes me how quickly those who once were the migrants forget that past, become insiders, and then forget what the position of the other is. We also come from a country which in 1937 adopted a constitution with a remarkably modern set of fundamental rights built into that constitution. Mm-hmm. And additionally, a category of of rights which were called at the time unenumerated rights, allowing the courts to discover rights as they went along. And some people would argue that the courts were a little bit slow in discovering some of those rights in certain fields, and having enough confidence in our judiciary to allow judges to do their jobs. Because if I think back to the reasons why the convention was adopted, we now in Europe, as you will know, are facing many, many different challenges, from rule of law backsliding in some states to very serious challenges within the Council of Europe member states.
No, indeed. Now I'm going to, before I hand us over to Cheryl, who's going to handle the question and answer, I just want to say that when you got your appointment to the Human Rights Courts in 2015, Charlie Flanagan, the minister at the time of Foreign Affairs, said Ireland attaches the highest importance to the European Court of Human Rights as the cornerstone of human rights protection in Europe, but that the authority of the court depends on the quality of its judges. So to your point, it's the judicial system that we rely on at the end of the day to be able to move our society forward and help us as a democracy. And thank you for your role that you're playing for all of us. As an Irish woman, I'm so proud of you, and to see an Irish woman in such a position. But I'm going to hand you over to Cheryl now and say thank you very much. And I had a million other questions, but hopefully we'll give everybody else a chance.
Thank you very much, Sue. And it's really been an honor to speak to you and to listen to Robert's glowing references to you. I hope we meet in person someday.
I hope so. I'd like that.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, we do have some questions which I'd love to take a few minutes to present to you, Dr. O'Leary. So Ruth Vickery is asking, in regards to gender-based discrimination and violence, how can issues around the role of capitalism in the marginalizing of women be addressed?
I think you may be directing the question to the wrong person, because as I said to Sue and the other organizers, I can't really trespass into, if you like, politics and political philosophy. I understand the question, and I think I leave that to one of your more experienced speakers to answer on another occasion.
Okay, very well indeed. How about this? Is there a case that you do not preside on that you would have loved to have been on the bench for?
Let me think. I suppose if I tell you the names of the cases, it might be very revealing of where I might have sat in a given case. The cases I sit in are so varied that it's difficult for me to say that I feel I've missed my time. And also because now I preside a section of 10 judges, and as a vice president, I sit in all the Grand Chamber cases. So I really am spoilt for choice. At the beginning of the year, we started with a case which is not easy, as you can imagine, Ukraine and the Netherlands against Russia, relating to events in Eastern Ukraine in 2014. The next week, we're dealing with whistleblowing involving LuxLeaks and Luxembourg. And next week, I'll be dealing with 2 cases involving extradition requests to the US, in which, of course, we have jurisprudence which says you cannot extradite someone to a country in which they may be subject to torture or inhumane and degrading treatment. And this would, of course, relate to the possibility of people being subjected to irreducible life sentences. So the cases that we sit in are so varied that I simply don't have time or the inclination to look back and say, oh, I wish I was in that one. And I think also, as I said to the organizers in our preparatory meeting, a judge's job is to be a public figure, but to be a very discreet one. The way I approach my work is, if nobody ever remembers my name after I've worked in Strasbourg, but they're still citing the cases on which I worked, then I did my job. So it's not really about me. It's more about the cases and the applicants and the states. But if you look at our website, you'll see the range, and you'll see how, I suppose, lucky we are to have such a range.
So that presents another interesting question. You talked about the evolution of the court, and today I understand, or this question is suggesting there are 70,000 cases pending before the court. And so how does the court choose the cases to hear? Are you able to set priorities?
It's a very, very good question. As I said, between 1959 and 76, they dealt with 18 cases. We have 70,000 pending. And at one stage in 2011, the number went up to 160,000. Now, to explain, this is not because the judges weren't doing their work. It's because of the way the European Court of Human Rights works. And each individual in the Council of Europe, and there are about 820 million people living in that geographical space, can potentially introduce an individual application before the European Court of Human Rights. They're meant to have gone through their national courts before they come to us. But that explains the 70,000 pending cases. We have a very targeted and important priority policy, whereby we deal with potential violations of the core rights, the right to life, the right not to be tortured or subject to inhumane and degrading treatment, or people in detention. We try and deal with these cases as quickly as we can. We also have a very important filtering function. So every month, single judges deal with very large agendas. They can be dealing with 200 cases on any given agenda, where if there are admissibility or procedural problems with these cases, we simply decline to examine them. But that does leave a core of very difficult, complex cases, which should normally be dealt with by judges in a chamber of 7. And in the last year, we've tried to adapt our priority policy even further, where we identify, as soon as they're lodged, what we call impact cases, cases dealing with new, difficult societal issues, climate change, data protection, surveillance, technology and freedom of expression, COVID cases. We try and pick them up very, very quickly so that we can process them more quickly. But I should say, we are only 47 judges for 70,000 cases. And sadly, we do not have the resources that we need. We are not at all as well financed as the European Union Court, for example. But we do our best in the time we have. But that too is a source of sleepless nights for any judge at my court.
Sure. Taking it back around, we have, I think, time for one more question, bringing it back to a bit more personal. You are widely published, but what do you like to read for pleasure? And what's on your book stand this evening?
Great question. As someone who I have to read hundreds of pages of law each week. And I have to read law both in depth and at speed. There are different techniques that you develop. So in fact, during the working week, I just can't pick up a novel, because if I get engaged in it, I simply won't put it down. What I love reading is, I do quite a lot of political reading. I love New York Review of Books, London Review of Books. I love blogs. I'm afraid I am a little bit of a law buff. So I mean, I do read legal blogs all the time. And then when I'm on holiday, I take out the novels. The one I just read when I was in Lisbon was Claire Keegan, the small novella about the Magdalen laundries in Ireland, which I found very touching, sobering. To read that it was set in 1985 was quite something. So I do love reading novels, but I try and keep them for my holidays. In the meantime, I'm afraid it's a lot of law and politics, which probably makes me sound like a very serious person.
Thank you. Well, that does bring us to the end of our session, and I want to, on behalf of the board of the Canada-Ireland Foundation and everyone in attendance this evening, thank you both for a wonderfully warm and stimulating discussion. Dr. O'Leary, your personal and professional journeys are inspiring, and I want to thank you for sharing with us those and the life of a judge on the European Court. And thank you for the work that you do protecting human rights day in and day out That is immense, and we're all very grateful to you for that. And thank you for participating as well at this very late hour of the day for you. And Susan, Dr. Storey, thank you for being our very capable interviewer this evening. It's been a fascinating discussion and watching the two of you, and we owe you a debt of gratitude for your participation tonight. Finally, I would like to thank the staff, the board, and all the volunteers at the Canada-Ireland Foundation for their work in bringing this evening together. And thank you all joining us from wherever you may be this evening. We're very, very pleased you could be here. Our next Canada-Ireland talk will be in May. But before that, please join us for our St. Patrick's concert on March the 11th with renowned Irish fiddle player Aoife Nivrian, Aoife Nivrian at the Weston Harbour Castle. And in April, over the 14th to the 16th, we'll be presenting an immersive performance experience performed by the wonderful Monica Magan. And for details and tickets for these events, please visit our website, CanadaIrelandFoundation.com. We hope to see you at these upcoming events. And in the meantime, thank you all for joining us and participating. And we wish you a safe and pleasant evening. Good night to all.